Hello. I'm Alec Smith. I'm a sculptor working in St. Paul, Minnesota. I sculpted the Salle image that we're talking about today, and I also sculpted the seated brother sculpture that's sitting on the north end of the main campus here. I'd like to take the next few minutes and talk to you about my workflow, how I create a life-size bronze sculpture from concept to creation of the final bronze. It starts with a digital concept that transforms into a life-size clay sculpture. From there, that transforms into a wax replica of that clay sculpture, and then finally, that transforms into the final bronze sculpture. When I first started this project, I was given a concept that was already in place, a 2D watercolor rendering done by Leslie. And so my first task was to take the design and the concept in this composition and to create a three-dimensional sculpture based on this 2D design. And so I needed to solve issues around the backside. What was it going to look like around the back? How do you make a sculpture that can be viewable from all angles, that's interactive, and that's going to draw people in and provide contrast and interest from different areas walking it around? And I also needed to figure out how do you make this to be a likeness of de Salle. And so I chose a painting done by Pierre Léger from 1734. This to me seemed to be the source of a lot of images that people have made of de Salle for the last few centuries. And this image is housed in the Institute of Brothers of Christian Schools in Rome. And so this is where I started. So I set out to create a highly detailed three-dimensional sculpture, digital sculpture of John Baptist de Salle. And after a few iterations, this is what we ended up with. And this was going to be the template of the bronze sculpture. So this would be the design that I followed through the process. And this can be a long process. This can be generally 10 months. We got it done a little quicker this time, but I usually say up to a year. It has the gesture and criteria of the original concept that was given to me, and it's also dynamic from 360 degrees, meaning that you can walk around and there's aspects that'll draw you in and be attractive to the viewer. The lines of the statue, or the lines in the structure of the drapery, provide contrast to the linearity of the archway, meaning, for instance, the mantle, I canted off just to the side, and because he's standing right at the archway, those vertical level lines of the archway in contrast to his mantle, I feel like provides a subtle contrast, and that's just an added layer of interest to bring people in. The movement is forward. There was the narrative I needed to follow was that he was walking through this transformational threshold, and so his movement is forward, but then he's also reaching out back to us, the viewer, and he's welcoming us to join him through. So I thought it would be a good idea, since a lot of times when I talk to people about creating digital sculpture, unless you've worked with the software or are familiar with the programs and working this way, it's hard to get the concept across. So I thought it'd be a good idea to give you a time-lapse photo of how I go about creating a digital sculpture. And this is actually work that, just a general bust that I did out of my head. It was about 2 hours long, and I put it in time-lapse and edited it down a little bit. But you can see I'm basically just working in digital clay. I'm just sculpting away or adding material just like I would with digital clay. And I'm moving around the object, building up the anatomy as I go. But this is a really convenient, advantageous way to work because I can make a highly detailed model for clients. In the lower vignette here, you can see how I'm working. I'm using a stylus on a tablet, and then in my left hand, I'm navigating through the UI via quick keys on the keyboard. And so this is how I made the de Salle model. I basically just started with raw geometry, pulled out different areas, building up, carving away, but just building up the anatomy and building up a figure, and then building up the drapery from there. But I can create a highly detailed model for clients. I can show them almost exactly give them a pretty good example of how this is going to look in the final output. And when you have a long project, it gives clients a high degree of confidence of what they're going to end up with. And I can spin it around, and I can also provide the ability to make changes, and changes always usually happen. So I can save these files out iteratively, and then I can work on a new one and make global or large-scale changes, and then we can move back and forth between that, settling on the one that we finally need and get approved. But you can see as I keep going, I'm just honing this down further and further, just finding the shapes as I move, scanning over the whole thing. And this is, like I said, how I did the deal with Salle. I build them up in a somewhat bare nude figure, and that way I know where all the joints and the muscularity and all the anatomy is. Then I drape the figure from there. So this is about 2 hours long. Of course, it took me a lot longer to do the deal with Salle. There's a lot of back and forth, and there's a lot more detail in certain areas. So from here, I can take this file once it's approved, and I can send it to a vendor that I use in Dassel, Minnesota called Outshaped, and they have a robotic arm with a motor and a drill bit on the end, and that robotic arm will mill away the foam, leaving just this sculpture, or leaving a core, an edited down version of this sculpture. And this is a great way to work to get the armature over quickly, because I need this foam as a foam core, as an armature to be able to apply the clay to. And the next step is applying and modeling clay in the life-size sculpture. But you have to take up a bunch of space on the inside, because the oil-based clay is cost prohibitive just to pile it all on. So you need something on the inside. But I don't always work this way. For instance, with the Seated Brother, I actually took cubes of foam, glued them together around a steel frame that I welded up, and then I carved the figure away by hand using rasps and knives and other tools. And like I said before, I'll start with a somewhat nude figure, and then I'll build up the drapery from there, because then I can know exactly where the joint flexes are, and I have a lot more higher degree of confidence of where that drapery and how it actually would look. So once I got the milled foam back, you can see all the general shapes are there. The large masses are there, the gesture's there. It makes it a lot quicker to transition to the clay side, and that's really convenient in a long project. You want to keep momentum going. You want to keep this idea fresh and keep things going, and so this is really convenient in that regards. But what's hard to see in this photo is that all the details are sort of blended over or generalized, because that drill bit is only a certain size, and it'll try to get in those areas, but it won't be able to get into the minute detail, and it'll tear away aspects of the foam too. So I have to take away a lot of this foam. I have to take away detail in the face, I have to take away detail in some of the areas on the drapery, and then undercuts, the area around behind the body in between the mantle. I have to go in and then physically take that out with my tools. But after I've done that and I'm ready to start applying clay, I'll fasten it to a steel frame on a cart, usually on wheels, to make sure it's a strong substructure that I can start applying clay to. I want to be able to work on this thing and push it around without worrying about it falling over. So here's a look in my roaster oven. I use, like I said, an oil-based clay, and I heat it up to about 150 degrees to 200 degrees. And that's because when it's cold, it's really hard and rubbery, but when I heat it up, it makes it extremely pliable, so I can move quickly, smearing the clay on, and I can build up large shapes. The oil-based clay is really advantageous because it doesn't dry. The open time is unlimited. So I can leave it open, and I can keep reworking stuff. With earth clay, of course, it's going to dry. You've got to keep misting it, and there's just a lot of problems that go with that. So this is just the industry standard. This is how people work, but you have to move both ways. You have to heat it up, and then you can actually work with it as it cools down too. So as I'm moving along, I will be constantly looking back at reference and looking at the drapery, for instance, or looking at the anatomy. And if I have a firm concept of how the reference acts, or like how the wrinkles actually actually look, that gives me the freedom to push the geometry a little bit further. And that, I feel like, is really the purpose behind sculpture and life-size figurative sculpture. You want it to be hyper-real. You want to provide shapes and geometry that are of interest to people, that draw people in, but you don't want to lose people and make them unbelievable. So you want to know those limitations on the reality. So I want to know where the actual wrinkles are going to be, so I don't go too far, but I do want to push them a little bit. And so as I'm working, I'll scan over the whole piece and work kind of collectively going over, not leaving any one point too long. This gives me the confidence that I'm keeping the sculpture, I'm giving it unity. I don't want to work in one place too long and then it starts to have a different look to it. I want to have everything kind of keep that as core concept, the core thesis statement of the piece, and everything I want to blend together. I want to have a cohesiveness together. I'm looking that if the forms are dynamic, they have the movement, they have the general concept that I'm looking for. The straight forms I want to be straight and I want to hone those down. The curved forms I want them to have the exact curve that I want. I want the silhouette to look the way I want it to look, and so I'm looking it over and making sure all these things are still there before I go on to the next step. I'm also looking at the anatomy and other features that are directly interactive with the people. This is a functional piece of art, and it is designed to be interactive with the public. And so I want these aspects to be inviting. I want the shapes, all the minute details in the hands. I don't want them to be too noodled, but I also want them to be welcoming and have the general shapes there and be recognizable. Once the final clay sculpture is done, the next step is to take a mold of it. And as you can see, the mold is taken in different sections. On the lower left-hand side is the arm section of Salle. On the right of that is the mid-torso section. To the right of that is the upper bust and portrait section. And then finally, on the far right is the lower legs and drapery there. And as you can see, these molds are made up of basically two materials. There's an inside rubber polyurethane mold, and then there's an outside resin, what's called a mother mold, and that's the structural element. And I brought in, as a visual aid, to give you an example of what this mold material is, an example of a smaller mold that I have from another piece of art. But so first, initially, this rubber mold is painted on, and it's a flexible polyurethane mold, and it's painted on as a liquid, and it's kind of like a syrupy liquid. It'll fall into all the crevices and details, and the purpose of it is to capture all the texture and all the details. And so this will be painted on in layers, allowed to cure and dry, and then built up to about 3/8 to 1/4 inch thick. And once that is set up, a resin mother mold will be spread over or painted over the top, and this is painted on or spread on in kind of a frosting consistency. And this mother resin mold is the structure for the polyurethane mold, because the next step after this is you pull off the mold from the clay sculpture, leaving a hollow mold. You got to make sure all the clay is out of there and it's absolutely clean, and then you'll have a negative image of the Salle sculpture. So the image is in the mold at this point, because the clay sculpture oftentimes gets destroyed in the process. After this, you pour molten wax. So if I were to pour a positive wax of this sculpture using this mold, I would pour molten wax into this mold. I would slush it around, and then I would dump it out. And I would do that several times until there's an even consistency coverage in the entire area of the mold. And that once that's done, you build that up to about an 1/8 inch thick. And so they would use these sections and pour molten wax in there, rotate around. That's why you can see the wax on the outside because there's constantly wax spilling around. You pour that up until it's about 1/8 of an inch thick, and then you remove the molds again. And once you remove the molds again, you have another positive replication of the clay sculpture, only in wax, and it's hollow. It's only about an 1/8 inch thick, and that's key to knowing how the bronze is cast into it. So once you have these waxes, you put on a few other pieces. You can notice at the top of the screen there's a red bar going across in one, and then there'll be a cone attached. And once these pieces are attached, they'll be sent over to the investment room. And so you have these hollow waxes. These are about an 1/8 inch thick, and it's sometimes hard for people to understand how hollow these waxes are, so I oftentimes compare it to a chocolate Easter bunny. If you've ever had a chocolate Easter bunny, they're always usually hollow, but they have the detail on the outside, and then they're poured on the inside, and that's essentially what those waxes are. So you'll take those hollow wax positives, you'll dip them into a ceramic slurry, and this slurry is about the consistency of pancake batter. So you have a big vat of this, you dip it into the slurry, and that slurry covers the inside of the wax and the outside of the wax. completely encapsulating the wax positive. You'll do that several times until you have like 3, maybe 4 times until you have a layered buildup. And this is it dries and cures to a ceramic material, and that's a crust that's investing or encapsulating that wax. Once that's done and cured, you'll send it over to the foundry or to the furnace and kiln room, and those invested waxes are put into a kiln, and the wax is melted out. And this is where the lost wax method is in the process. The wax is melted out, and all you'll have is that ceramic slurry, or the ceramic investment that stays the same, and that when that wax melts out, you'll have just an 1/8-inch thick cavity remaining throughout this investment process. And so I actually have a video of them pouring bronze. This bronze is heated up to 2,180 degrees. It's extremely hot. You can be standing 30 feet away and you can feel the blast of the metal being poured out. They're wearing protective gear, but it's a hard job to stand there and hold this. They'll fill up the crucible with this molten material, and it's interesting, that was De La Salle, and that was the seated brother. About 450 pounds of that for De La Salle, and about 350 pounds for the seated brother. So once they have a crucible full of bronze, they'll take it over, and at the same time, those investments that were being heated up in the kiln, someone will take those out of the kiln, place it in an area where they're stable, and immediately the bronze is going to be poured into those investments. So you can see the cone that was attached to the top, and that cylinder area, that's not solid down there, that's hollow. That's only about an 1/8-inch thick on the shell, and that's that invested, what was a wax. And so that bronze is being poured in, and it's filling that gap that the melted wax left. So they'll do this until they use up the remainder of their what they have in the crucible, but now you can see why they have to do it in sections, because you could only pour so much bronze at a time. So after this is done, that investment has to be taken off. So we'll clean off the investment off the cooled bronze. They'll have to take off those bars, the sprues and the gating, and that cone that was left off with cut-off wheels, and then they'll generally clean up the bronze, but then they have to reassemble all the bronze parts. And as you can see, this is the seated brother when we were reassembling him. As you can see, up along the arm there's a big gap there, and that's because when the wax cools, after it's been poured in molten, after it cools, it shrinks and contorts a little bit. The same thing happens with the bronze. Once it cools after being molten, it'll shrink and contort also. You actually lose consistently about 2% of the size from the life-size clay sculpture to the bronze final product. And so if I wanted a 6-foot, 72-inch tall De La Salle, I had to make the clay sculpture 74 inches or just about, and it's really consistent and really accurate, so we work that into the design. So they use tools and other means to forcibly push these pieces into place, and then they'll TIG weld the seam between the two parts using as a filler rod the same bronze material that was used for the rest of the bronze. And when you grind that away and you blend in the texture between the two parts, the seam you can't even notice it, because like I said, it's the same or bronze alloy, and they're so good at blending that in, you can't see it at all. Once the whole thing has been reassembled, you sandblast the final piece one final time. That opens up and unifies the surface completely. And after that, you can apply a patina to it, a chemical patina. And that's a chemical reaction that's sprayed onto the raw bronze, and that patinates or starts an aging process in the bronze. In this case, we used a general liver sulfur, a potash called patina. It's sprayed on, and then pretty quickly after, we spray water to stop the chemical reaction that leaves just sort of a rich golden patina. This can be left to keep going. What's interesting is this patina wasn't all that much lighter than the seated brother when we originally sprayed the patina on him. But as you can see, the seated brother is actually really dark. It's developing a nice rich patina, and so they continue to patinate after the wax wears off. And so after the patina is done, a wax will be applied to it. It's usually heated up, a paste wax is put on, and that gives us a protectant for shipping and also a few years out in the elements. After a while, the wax will wear off and it'll start to patinate. But that patina is actually a protective layer on the bronze. If you notice, the Statue of Liberty, for instance, that green is actually patina, and it actually protects the bronze from the elements. So once the wax is put on, we will either package the statues up for freight, or in this case, we lashed De La Salle in the back of a trailer, and I tucked him in and delivered him down to Lewis that day for a installation the following morning. So after the projects, or after these statues are installed, the greatest reward for me trying to create a functional piece of art that's part of a larger project is either seeing or hearing people interact with these. And when I installed the Seated Brother, I went to go have lunch with Brother Paul Joslin, and as I was walking away, I was already noticing people interacting with the sculpture, and there's just no greater reward. It gives me a lot of momentum to want to move on to the next project and keep going. And so with that, my hope is that this sculpture will inspire people to want to interact, to want to develop their own relationship with De La Salle, to want to learn about his teachings and his writings and the meaning behind them. And with that, thank you very much. Hand it back to Kurt.